Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you. Thanks for joining us for Issues and Answers, the media and the election. I'm Fred Martino. Every year, Gallup surveys our trust in the media, including newspapers and the broadcast media. Just 10 years ago, half of Americans expressed a great deal, or at least a fair amount of trust in the press. By 2014, trust had dropped to 40%. And fewer than a third of Americans say they trust the media in this presidential election year. We wondered what's going on. In recent months, media critics have expressed dismay at the coverage of the presidential campaign, particularly the coverage on commercial television, dominated by Donald Trump's latest tweet and poll after poll after poll. Does this letter to the editor in the Albuquerque Journal sum things up for you? Why can't all media reporting focus on pivotal issues? How problems are solved, how compromise, consensus, and agreeing to disagree are important for a win-win situation and the future of our democracy. So you might be thinking, that's just one person. Surely the media would focus on directly relevant issues if it heard from lots of people, right? Well, not always. Here is a recent email from AARP. Want to hear something incredible? AARP activists like you drove more than 100,000 letters to Lester Holt to help shape the presidential debate. But after 90 minutes of back and forth, Social Security didn't come up once. During the next hour, we will hear what our audience wants from the media, and we'll take their questions for our panel of experts. From New Mexico State University, longtime broadcast journalist and professor Nick Miller, and from NMSU's Government Department, Dr. Christina Medina. Thank you both for being here.
Good to be here, Fred.
Good to have you here. We also have with us today Opinions page editor Walt Rubel from the Las Cruces Sun News and reporter Lauren Villagran of the Albuquerque Journal. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you.
I want to get to our audience questions in just a few minutes, but I want to start with a few questions of my own. And Nick, I want to begin with you. Your thoughts on how political coverage has changed since your days at the anchor desk, and I realize it changed while you were at the anchor desk for decades.
It changed a lot. I was in TV for 30 years, and I've been out of it for about 7 now. And I think the biggest change that I've seen over the years is 2 things. There's more coverage of the horse race, and there's more attention paid to sensationalism. The horse race, I think, has been creeping up on us for years and years and years. This idea of sensationalism has really exploded this year when, Donald Trump and everything that's going on with him. But I think those are the 2 basic things that have really changed a lot since then. It seems like there's less coverage of the actual issues and more coverage of personalities and horse race than ever before.
Would you say in this particular presidential election it's really unprecedented, maybe because we have a personality like Donald Trump?
Yeah, I think so. It is unprecedented to a great degree. There has been, I think there's always been some of that sensationalism and coverage of political, especially presidential campaigns. But with Donald Trump there, it's like a car wreck. Everybody looks at a car wreck. Everybody looks at a disaster. And so that's attention getting. When we teach students what is newsworthy, one thing that we teach them that is newsworthy is something novel, different, sensational. And other things that are newsworthy are things that affect a lot of people, like taxes and fees and things like that, and education.
Social Security, right?
And Social Security.
So let me ask you this, and we should mention, for the last 7 years, you have been working here at New Mexico State University.
Well, 5.
Teaching journalists who will, many of them will get into broadcast journalism. Some already
That's
have
right.
that
Yes.
you've mentored. How do you impart the importance of political and public policy coverage to your students?
I try to get them really interested in current events, to keep up with the news, to know what the issues are, to have some kind of a working knowledge with current events, because that's what they're going to be doing every day. You know, whether it's a feature story or whether it's a real hard news story, they have to know some current events that are going on so that they can cover it with some degree of expertise.
Yeah. Christina, you teach at NMSU in the government department. I should mention, for full disclosure, that you were a teacher of mine when I was getting a doctorate here at NMSU, so we know each other.
Yes.
You have to impart to students the historical significance of freedom of the press in our country. And I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little about that, because I think about it every night now when I think about the coverage of this election.
Okay, sure, yes, and thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure, and I hear congratulations are in order as well. You are also now Dr.
Yes.
Martino, and I'm proud to be able to say that. And I think in our classes it's very important we talk about being current on current events, knowing media coverage, and so we just celebrated Constitution Day here. Our department played a part in that, and so we passed out copies of the U.S. Constitution, and so we wanted to have an exercise in how many of us really understand what the Constitution is, all the parts, and those civil rights and liberties that are afforded to us through the U.S. Constitution. So it's very significant in that the Constitution says that Congress shall make no law abridging or limiting the freedom of the speech or press, and so this speech is liberty. It's the ability to speak without fear of government restraint, and so it's the right to speak and to be heard. And so I think any type of vibrant democracy depends on this notion, and so we only have to look at the ways in which this has been restricted. Some of our international counterparts, how even censorship of the media, the internet, all very vibrant sources of information, and all of that contributes to our knowledge of political truth. And so with that freedom, we have diversity of thought and diversity to draw that truth from, and come to our own conclusions and become consumers of the media and information as well.
And it's
so
fascinating that our
very
founders understood that. They understood that when so long ago. When you talk about broadcast coverage today, particularly of the presidential election, focusing on polls and really the insults of the day, how does that affect representative democracy in your view?
Okay, well, we've become a more complex society, and so if we think back to the difference between direct democracy, representative democracy, citizens have trust that our representation will carry out our wishes, and so direct democracy is almost, it's much difficult in today's society with so many people. And so we really do rely on accurate information. So the polls are one piece of information, but we also need to look at how the poll information is produced. And so what are the sources? In my American government class, when we talked about polls, I really urge students to look at where are these polls coming from, who puts them together, and where do they get their sources of information. So again, encouraging our students to become consumers of information, later producers of information in our graduate classes as well.
Okay, I want to move on now to the journalists on our panel, and we'll be getting to our audience questions in just a few minutes. And I really have the same question for both Walt and Lauren. Lauren, I want to begin with you. Your assessment of how the media is doing in the coverage of the presidential race. And it's important to note the media isn't everyone, so that broadcast and non-broadcast coverage differs greatly. There has been a lot of great reporting in newspapers, the Washington Post in particular, and in recent days, the New York Times, revealing tax records of Donald Trump that shed some new light on the failure that he had in business, losing almost $1 billion in 1 year. Your thoughts on this?
That is such a big question. I feel like I'm going to have a hard time even answering it. I have to say that for my colleagues in broadcast, especially on the 24-hour news networks, it is hard. They have to fill this enormous amount of time, and unfortunately a lot of it is the kind of sensational reporting that you're talking about. As far as the newspapers go, I mean, like you said, the Washington Post and the New York Times have been doing great work when it comes to the presidential election. The New York Times just took a huge stand in releasing Donald Trump's tax forms. They are probably going to see some kind of legal action, and it could be a big deal. When you look at the role of papers like the Las Cruces Sun News here in Las Cruces or the Albuquerque Journal in Albuquerque at the state level, I actually think I would beg to differ with some of the assessment of covering just the horse race or just the kind of sensational aspects. My colleagues at the Journal almost do nothing but write about issues. And so even when it's not about the politics themselves, those articles about higher education, about mental health, about taxes, whatever it might be, are informing, hopefully informing voters so that they can make a decision when it comes to the political aspect. I cover southern New Mexico, so I don't cover politics specifically, but I hope that the issues that I write about that affect the border or that affect our nuclear facilities in New Mexico is information that might inform voters. So as far as how the media is doing, I don't think I could make a blanket assessment.
It depends on what media you're talking about, right? So Walt, what's your thoughts?
Well, I agree that there has been a huge difference between print and TV. TV is very much a soundbite based media, and so you can't do a comprehensive look at somebody's tax plan in a soundbite. So what you get is the as Nick said, the horse race and the insult of the day. And I think the person who that just drove nuts was Bernie Sanders. Because Bernie Sanders, every time he went on TV, all he wanted to talk about was the 1% and how we're all getting screwed by the 1%. And all of the person talking to him wanted to talk about was, what are you going to drop out? Have you seen the polls? Have you seen how bad it is? And that just drove him over the top. But Lauren is absolutely right, and I would throw USA Today, who I worked for, in there as well. Very early in the process, they came out with a very comprehensive look at Donald Trump's business dealings, his lawsuits, how many people sued him for not getting paid for work that they had done for him. So there is a wealth of information that is out there for any, and that's just Donald Trump. We haven't even got into Hillary Clinton and the email situation in Benghazi and everything else.
I should mention that before I got into public media, now about 17 years ago, I spent some time working in commercial television as a reporter and a news anchor. And one of the big changes that I noticed, and I think this does affect newspapers too, not just television. And it's because we all are in the website business now and the social media business, that immediate, what just happened. Yeah. And this is something that I've noticed as a big change. It just hasn't been in this presidential election, but over the course of the last 10 years, really, with the internet, that somehow, if something just happened, no matter what it is, it's given a level of importance because it just happened. And you see this with newspapers, TV, radio, because it just happened, we got to report it. What are your thoughts on it?
One of the things that drives me nuts, and Nick just said about CNN, is they'll have a crawler at the bottom of the screen that says breaking news 24/7. I mean, somebody went and picked up their garbage, breaking news.
You know the reason they do that?
I don't.
It's cheap and it's easy.
Yeah.
Because if you really want to do real investigative journalism, whether it's in newspaper or television, you have to have a reporter off the air for a long time to get all the facts and get everything together. Breaking news is easy to do. There's a car wreck out there, send a camera and a reporter, bang, you're on the air for a minute and a half or so, and you cover it easily and cheaply. And that's the reason.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's interesting. So, Lauren?
I was just going to say, I think newspapers do that too because of our immediacy on the web. So this just happened, was it this week or last week, when I believe Hillary Clinton at some point had presented a proposal for national service, and there was, she had this whole policy that she laid out, but Donald Trump's middle of the night tweet storm about a former Miss Universe trumped the rest of that coverage. I think a number of media outlets backtracked to look at that, to look at Secretary Clinton's proposal later, but Donald Trump has actually been brilliant at dominating the news cycle because of his behavior.
And having his surrogates do that. I mean, in recent days, what an example. The New York Times coming out with Donald Trump's tax records showing he lost nearly $1 billion in 1 year. And most of the news coverage, and I have to say that this is not just broadcast, but also online and in newspapers, has been giving time to this notion brought up by Chris Christie and Rudy Giuliani, and now by Donald Trump himself, that, well, this just shows he's a genius because of the fact that he was able to avoid paying taxes. And I think that's very interesting that there's been little focus on how did he lose $1 billion? And that's particularly relevant, I think you might argue, because a lot of his campaign is saying, I should be president because I am a good businessman.
Well, so this is not answering your question directly, but there's an issue about whether, you brought it up at the beginning, whether people believe the media at all. So there's this idea that if you come to a story with a particular point of view, there may not be much that even a breaking story like that can do to change your opinion. There's actually some Pew research that I have here that this is actually incredible, that news media are seen by the majority as having a negative effect on the nation. 70% of respondents to this poll believe that the news media is having a negative effect on the nation, which I think is a little bit shooting the messenger, but that tops corporations, banks and financial institutions, and this is after the massive recession caused by their behavior. Labor unions, colleges and universities are doing quite well, and so are churches. But
one of the reasons we're doing this show, well, I want to get your opinion on this notion. I mean, besides the immediacy factor, the idea that what a particular political candidate or his surrogates might say seems to drive the narrative rather than an examination of the actual facts.
Well, there has been a lot of discussion within the media surrounding this election as to the question, has fact-checking become quaint? Has fact-checking become outdated? I mean, this is the election of the I don't care at least voter. It doesn't matter what you tell them. If they're a supporter of Donald Trump, you tell them something horrible about Donald Trump. I don't care at least he, and then they'll say something bad about Hillary Clinton. Same way the other way around. I don't care at least she, and then come up with something that the other person has done that's worse. And it just seems to me that that is sort of what we have fallen into in this election. And it's not a discussion of the tax plans or the health care plans or any of these things that voters say they want. It's really is a race to the bottom.
And it's a talk show. It's not journalism.
That's
when we
right.
get into that.
And Fred, I think you used a word there that's very explanatory about this narrative. It seems like the media will lock onto a narrative about a candidate or about an issue, and they will play that narrative out whether the facts agree with it or not sometime. And that narrative will drive the coverage and until it just plays out completely. And I think that's one problem with it, because they get into this theme of a story, that narrative, and they want their stories to fit into that narrative. And I've seen that as well.
A lot in this election. We want to welcome our audience members to come up to the microphone and ask questions now. And we should say we have a lot of New Mexico State University students with us today in the audience. I'm very excited about that. Part of what we're doing here is examining the issues, but also giving voice to young voters who very often don't get to ask questions on television. Their voices, their opinions on issues also are not shared widely in the media. And we have our first question.
Good evening. My name is Carlos. I'm a student here at New Mexico State University pursuing a degree in photojournalism. So in May of this year, it was revealed that George Stephanopoulos had donated over $75,000 to the Clinton Foundation over the last 3 years. He was exposed because he didn't release this to the public, and ABC has backed him, saying that it was an honest mistake. My question to the panel is, do you think journalists should associate themselves with political organizations, even if it runs the risk of running a conflict of interest to the journalist and the news organization?
Okay, so very good question. And Nick, let me start with you on that. This is something that I think is so fascinating. Journalists, we have to be so careful that no one sees something that we have done, whether it's something as big as a donation or even what party we're registered with, for fear that it will make it look as if we're biased against one candidate or one party. Your thoughts on this?
Well, you do have to be careful, and we all have opinions. We all have, I think most journalists probably have pretty deep opinions about a lot of things because we're involved with that sort of thing. But we can have those opinions, but our professionalism is when we go on the air or when we write the articles, and then the professionalism kicks in so that we are as objective as possible.
Because party registration is public information. I've always been registered as an independent, or in the case of New Mexico, a do not state, right? Do you think that's a good idea for journalists?
I don't see anything wrong with it. To register as a member of a party.
I mean, you don't see anything wrong with registering with a party?
No, I don't.
That's very interesting. This came out about Lester Holt because
of course, exactly. That's what I was going to mention.
Donald,
and you can go to extremes. Jim Lehrer, who used to anchor the PBS NewsHour, he never even voted because he said he didn't want to sully his objective professionalism. I think that's going a bit far. And I don't think there's anything wrong with a journalist registering with one party or another. Again, I think you have to trust yourself that you're going to be, as non-biased and as objective as possible.
And some disagree. I mean, Lester Holt, it was revealed he's registered as a Republican, has
after
been
Donald
for a long time
called him a
because
Democrat.
Donald Trump called him a Democrat, and it turned out that wasn't true. He guessed. We don't guess in journalism. Very important rule. Rule 1, right?
That's
Christina,
right.
what are your thoughts on this? Should besides really obvious things like you would never donate to a presidential campaign, for instance, how about this notion? Should journalists register with a party, or should they, in trying to ensure that no one assumes they are biased, that they register as an independent?
Yeah, I don't see, in terms of having party affiliation, so voter participation is very important. There's an immense amount of apathy right now. But at the same time, we talk about perceived conflict of interest. So those, even for political involvement of government employees, there have been rules and regulations that govern that as well. So I think the political participation is the most important, but at the same time, even candidates who enter public office will do so under the assumption of clean government. So anything that can be construed as having a conflict of interest, for example, someone running for office who has a foundation, regardless of the nature of that foundation. So many have kind of, under the auspice of clean government, good, transparent government, have kind of pulled back from those types, and there are obviously rules and regulations that everything from small gifts, contributions, to not influence that particular aspect. So, but again, being registered to vote and having a party affiliation, again, I don't see. You might want to be discreet about it, but at the same time, I don't see that as being problematic.
There are limits. You wouldn't go out and campaign for a
or have
person,
a sign in the yard,
or have a sign in the yard, or something
exactly.
like that. There are limits.
And we should mention this is a little more complicated for journalists in New Mexico, because if you're like me and you don't register with the party, you're shut out of the primary. In other states where I was an independent, I could still vote in the primary. Not in New Mexico, because we have a closed primary. Real quickly, want to get to our next question, but should journalists be registered with a political party, or should they stay independent?
I think that's fine. I just wanted to say real quickly, I've got a problem with George Stephanopoulos. I've got a problem with somebody who was never a journalist, has no grounding in journalism school, made his name in politics, and now he's pretending to be a journalist, in my opinion.
So I was going to echo Walt's comments with respect to Stephanopoulos. He's a pundit. He's not a journalist. As a pundit, he should also disclose that, I think. I don't know if I have a problem with journalists registering Democrat or Republican. I also have a close colleague who I recently found out has never voted specifically to protect his objectivity. I do vote, but I would extend that beyond the elections. As a journalist, I feel a responsibility to even not get involved in certain organizations or in organizations generally. I'm very careful about the organizations that I might belong to, especially now that I'm based. Previously, I was a foreign correspondent. I could kind of do what I wanted in Mexico because that wasn't affecting national politics. But here in New Mexico, I just, you've got to maintain, it's not necessarily objectivity, it's independence, so that you can come to a place of real empathy when you're talking to someone from any party or from any point of view.
And of course, the appearance of independence, because that's really a big part of this too, because of course, folks can be involved in organizations, they can be registered with a party and still do their job as a journalist. So I agree with that, but I find it interesting, and I must say I'm surprised that I'm the only one who thinks that journalists, it's best if we don't register with a political party. So this is why we do shows like this. It's very fascinating to find these things out. Another question.
Good evening. My name is Selena Madrid. I'm a student at NMSU as well. I have a question regarding not the media, but the election coming up. With the election inching closer, a lot of people, I think, are voting. Do you think people are voting for Hillary Clinton because she is a woman and because she is making history? Maybe because they're not really uneducated, because they are uneducated about like the presidential election. And also I have another question. A lot of people are saying that they're not going to vote because neither of them are qualified. So what is your take on people not using their right to vote, and your take on Hillary Clinton gaining more voters because she is a woman?
Okay. Christina, why don't you jump in on that, because I think this is really important, and it again emphasizes the importance of journalism focusing on real issues, public policy issues, because we don't want to think that folks aren't going to vote. We don't want to think that folks are going to vote for someone simply because of a demographic characteristic.
Well, we would hope that our voters take the time to learn the issues, the candidates. As I said before, there's an immense amount of apathy, even among, all we have to do is look at the voter turnout rates amongst young college-age students to be able to see what that has been. And without a doubt, gender has been magnified in this election due to its historical significance. If Hillary Clinton is elected, she will become our first female president. And so, but there's a lot of research that suggests who we are, our gender, our socioeconomic status. All of these factors may influence our party affiliation. And so from that, I think our job as voters is to become educated and look at those issues. However, I think, again, as to the qualification of these candidates, we can look at, Donald Trump has come from outside government. Hillary Clinton has a long political career that she's worked on. And so, again, I think we look at all these different factors, and so for some of us, we're watching.
On her second question, have you talked to folks who've said this to you? I mean, I've had people say this to me, I'm not going to vote because I don't like either one of them.
Oh, definitely.
And
definitely.
what do you say to them? I mean, what's the response?
Well, my response, and so I'm the daughter of an immigrant parent who obviously I was instilled who took me to vote in my first election. And so as a family, when you don't have that right, I think you know what that becomes. So after my father became naturalized, that was one of the things. When I turned 18, he made sure that I voted in the election. And so I'm forever impacted by my father's politics.
Thank you for sharing
to not have that right, I think, as citizens, we should vote, because it's, and women in general, it took us a long time to gain the right to vote. So so my response would be vote for someone. Again, we have a two-party, the likelihood for independence, so we can work to create change. There are some that believe that we should reform the Electoral College and the popular vote as well versus Electoral College vote. And so, but I would say activism is preferred to apathy. And so regardless, I would like to say vote.
And we should also say, I mean, even if a particular issue isn't that important to you, don't forget that the next president will likely be nominating several candidates for the Supreme Court. So your vote will have an effect for generations. This is, if there's no other reason for you today to think about voting, that should do it. Next question.
Well, along the lines of people that don't like either candidate, I was going to ask, by denying a third-party candidate, whether it's Gary Johnson, Jill Stein, or whoever, a place at the debates, is the American voter cheated out of gaining new knowledge about a candidate that could sway an election?
Let me ask you that question. Let's start with you, Lauren. Is this something that we're going to have to reassess this year? The Presidential Commission said there had to be an average of 15% support in polls for a third-party candidate to participate in the debates. What do you think about it?
I would just say from the perspective of a journalist, I'd always rather hear more than less. I would rather hear from everybody who's aspiring. I guess my opinion would be that it does make sense to have some threshold for entering a debate, but I'm not sure that's the right one.
Right, because we'd have 50 people on the stage.
But again, talking about polls, maybe polls aren't the right threshold. I haven't given a lot of thought to that question, so I would just leave it at the answer that.
Well, yeah, I would say that. I'm sorry, what were we talking about?
We were talking about this notion, our audience member, that folks are shut out of the full
debate.
picture by not having the third-party candidates in debates.
Sorry, that's right. I actually had a chance to do this when I came to New Mexico in 2004. We did a debate in the gubernatorial race that year where David Bacon was the Green Party candidate. And we decided to include him along with Bill Richardson and John Sanchez. And having gone through that process, I thought it was a mistake. I thought, here was somebody who obviously wasn't going to get elected. And just in that situation, he just really didn't add a lot to the debate. And he did distract from the conflict that was taking place between the two people who did have a chance to win, I thought.
Yeah, and for critics of folks who put on debates, and I should mention, Walt, we're working with the Las Cruces Sun News on a congressional debate, full disclosure, coming up later in October. This becomes a real fairness issue if you go beyond the Republican and the Democrat, because then what do you have? You have 10 people on the stage? I mean, this does become an issue.
That's right. And the reason I blanked there for a second, the thing that I did want to say is all of our focus here has been on the presidential race. So for folks who say, I don't want to vote because I don't like Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, well, how do you feel about the county commission? Because, if you're not happy about the way that's being run, here's your chance to change it. How do you feel about the state legislature? How do you feel about the fact that the person who's our county treasurer right now is admitted to sexually harassing? How do you feel about all that stuff? Here's your chance to go. And so it's
That's right.
not
If you don't
just
vote
the
for president,
race.
you also don't vote for a lot of other races.
That's right.
And we've had a number of them in recent years that have just been a handful of votes that decided the election. Another question.
My name is Jessica Nevadas, and I'm a student here at NMSU as well. My question to you all, more toward the journalist side, is how do you think the media coverage is going to change after the presidential election? Because I know it's been the biggest hype, and especially with Donald Trump, like you all said, how do you think it's going to change after the newly elected president?
Is your question, how should it change?
Yeah, how should it change? How do you think without Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton constantly in the news, how do you think it's going to change?
You're hungry for more news, right?
Yeah.
Me too. Nick,
Well,
how should it change?
Well, of course, after the election, the focus will be on the president-elect and what cabinet he or she chooses and the policies that they'll be laid out. And there's typically a honeymoon period for that person. I don't know if there will be this time or not. We never can tell. But I think it will change in that way because
and a lot of times it's unpredictable, though, isn't it?
It's very unpredictable.
George W. Bush, he really ran with the idea of not intervening elsewhere, and then 9/11 happens.
Yeah.
You know, and his whole presidency and the whole country changed forever.
No nation building, and then all of a sudden we are nation building in Iraq.
But in terms of the media, though, there already is an amazing amount of self-reflection going on right now.
Exactly.
And there will continue to be after the election. Donald Trump has presented us with something that we just have never faced before. And it's been a challenge.
Yeah, I've been looking at, it's called the Shorenstein study out of Harvard University, and it's they've been covering all this. In the early primaries, Trump was receiving about 57% positive coverage as against 43% negative. After he got nominated, it switched 39% positive, 61% negative. And their point is there that the person who rises to the top is the person who gets shot at. You know, that's what people in the Army and the Marine Corps will tell you. If you're up there on the hill, you're going to get shot at.
And many people wish there was more investigative reporting during the primaries.
Exactly. And again, when there were, 17 Republicans running, it was all horse race then, because, you know, and then once there was an identifiable nominee, then they started changing their coverage to be a little more investigative.
You know, it's interesting because I think it depends on, to further answer the question, I think it may depend on who becomes president. If you look at the way that Donald Trump has treated the reporters covering his campaign, it could be a very different picture for the White House press corps in a Trump presidency versus what I would expect to be a more traditional status quo operation in a Clinton presidency. I mean, he's actually thrown reporters off his trail. I don't know that that's happened in modern
entire media
news
organizations from covering his campaign.
Yeah, what happens after the election, I think, is going to be determined in a large part by who's in the White House.
Yeah, interesting. Another question?
Yeah, kind of going back to a question previously asked. A lot of people have been saying that they're just not going to vote. A lot of other countries, like Australia, I know, has a mandatory voting policy. How do you think that would affect elections here in the U.S.?
Boy, that is an interesting idea, isn't it? A mandatory voting.
Is there mandatory studying before you vote? Because I kind of suspect there isn't.
You get fined in Australia. We did a story about this because we have a reporter from Australia, and you get fined if you don't vote. It's mandatory.
I don't know if it'd work here. I think a lot of people would revolt at that.
Well, when we did interviews on the street, no one liked the idea, which I thought was very interesting.
But I think it would probably change the complexion of the election quite a lot.
Yeah. Christine?
I think we need to provide the space to vote. So we have a lot of national holidays, even making it easier for people to get out and go to the polling booths would be an improvement. So I'd like to see
would you like to see
some time given off.
Would you like to see mandatory voting?
No, not necessarily mandatory voting, but I would like to see it having that space to allow people to get to polls easier.
What do you say
maybe
to
a holiday to allow people to vote? I don't know.
What do you say to a critic though who says, look, we've got to do certain things in a civilized society. We can't refuse jury duty. Right? We're required to serve on the jury if we're asked.
Sure. Again, it goes to that volunteer participation, so I think that's important as well. So the mandatory aspect is a different. I like the idea. It's worth considering, but I do like the idea that we will vote because it's something important to us.
I like the idea of making it a national holiday, where people are off that day and they don't have to worry about.
I'm always for another holiday, so I give full approval to that one. We have another question.
My name is Stephanie. I'm a journalism student here at NMSU as well, and my question was that I'm a journalism student, so I am pretty well informed about the election, but how do you think the media has influenced young voters in being more well informed about the upcoming election?
Okay. Oh, wow.
I have some statistics.
Well, good. Jump on it.
I like so
Pew Research did a study that said that 91% of U.S. adults, that would include young adults as well, did learn about the 2016 presidential election in the past week. So the media is communicating with people. 24%, so about a quarter of people got the information that they received on cable TV news. News websites were about 13% of people. Radio was 11%. So people are getting a lot of information. Whether, I don't know if I can speak to exactly how young people are getting their information or whether that encourages them to vote. I think that the stakes are so high in this presidential election, or at least they've been painted to be so high, that more people are going to go to the polls. I recently did a story about people who have been in New Mexico as legal permanent residents for decades, who have never gotten their U.S. citizenship for a variety of reasons, either because they were concerned about speaking Spanish only or they never saw the point. And applications for U.S. citizenship in New Mexico and West Texas are up enormously over the last year. There are a lot of groups here working to get people to register to vote. So the interest is there.
And we should say it's working.
It's working.
I mean, locally and in the state of New Mexico, more people are registering to vote. So this is one bright spot in our presidential campaign. Another question.
Hello, my name's Shelby Herrera. I'm an agriculture communications student here at NMSU. My question is, it's kind of related to the poll you spoke about earlier, with so many people not trusting the media and some major media siding with one party or the other, how do you work to educate the public about the true facts and everything that's going on, not just one side or the other?
Great question. And you know, Nick, when we talked at the beginning of the show about changes over the course of our decades-long careers in journalism, this is a huge one that began in the mid-1990s. The birth of cable television channels that called themselves news channels, and of course I'm talking about the Fox News Channel, that actually really are more about opinion, and that they go toward one political party. And MSNBC became that way on the other side of the aisle in recent years. Your thoughts on this and the effect this has?
I think it's had a huge effect. You know, people talk about the divided society. I think this is one of the big reasons for it, because, well, it was probably there to begin with, but now people have a place to go and have a place to identify with that, and then they go that place, and then they get caught in what they call the echo chamber, that all they hear are people who agree with them. And I think that's dangerous, because if that's the only thing you seek out are articles or broadcast media or newspapers or that just agree with you, then you're not getting the full picture. You know, you're not getting those opposing voices that might cause you to think about it a little bit rather than just regurgitate talking points, because I think that's the effect that it's really had. Like I said, it was probably there to begin with because people believe different things all over the country. But when you have a place for all of them to go, whether it's on the left or the right or wherever, and that's the only thing they listen to, then again the echo chamber becomes predominant.
Yeah, and that's not just TV. As the daily newspaper has given way to the internet, you know, people are going to blog sites, Huffington Post, you know, Red State, that confirm their worldview, and they're not being challenged by opposing opinions. It's not just what they see on TV, it's what they read as well.
As opinion page editor for the Las Cruces Sun News, you can also speak to this issue in the sense of the newspaper side of things, that very often we hear the folks say, well, that's a Democrat newspaper or that's a Republican newspaper, and what they're talking about, of course, are the editorials that appear in the newspaper that may lean more toward Republican or Democratic views of the day. This is why newspapers always try, and should always try, right, to have a real barrier between the opinion pages and the news.
That's right, and we hope people understand that you know, we do endorsements on every race, and people will question us, well, you've got a story on the front page telling us that's supposed to be objective, and then I turn over 4 more pages and you're telling me who to vote for. That doesn't sound right. And so for people who just aren't, I hate to use the word educated, but just don't understand the difference between the editorial page and the other newspapers, the other pages in the newspaper, that could be a challenge for us. And sometimes I think newspaper editorial endorsements certainly don't have the impact that they used to.
It's been fascinating in this election because we've had newspapers that don't endorse, like the USA Today, actually issue a statement that you should not vote for Donald Trump. We're not going to endorse anyone, but don't vote for Donald Trump. And then we've had newspapers that have almost never endorsed Democrats endorse Hillary Clinton.
And that's the thing. I mean, if they really made a difference, we would have seen a huge swing. Because Lauren and I were talking earlier, there's not a major daily newspaper in the country that has endorsed Donald Trump. So if what we had to say really was able to sway opinion, certainly he wouldn't be doing as well as he is.
Right. Another question.
My name is Mark Saldana. I'm also a journalism student here at NMSU. Going back to endorsements, I know President Barack Obama has recently endorsed Hillary Clinton. He recently said that if you vote for a third-party candidate, you're basically giving Donald Trump a vote. If you're not voting for Clinton, you're giving Donald Trump a vote. What are your thoughts on that recent statement from President Barack Obama?
Christina, you want to take that one?
Wow. Okay. So again, repeat the last part. If you're not.
I was reading something that he said. If you're voting for your third-party candidate who is basically not even good in the polls, you're basically giving Donald Trump a vote, and if you're not voting at all, you're giving Donald Trump a vote. That's what he said recently. Okay. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, in a system like ours, it's a winner take all. So there is not a second place in terms of who comes out ahead. But with this, I think we have to look at the history, the likelihood, the involvement. But I think even third parties have played an incredible role. Even influencing probably more the issues that the two parties take on, Democrats and Republicans. So regardless of how you vote, I think that it should be tied to some of the issues, because those third parties have made a difference in terms of platform.
And the truth is, the polls can change. But if a race is very, very close, indeed, if you don't vote, or if you vote for a third-party candidate, you may have an impact one way or another that is unintended, for sure. So that's important to know.
The argument will go on forever whether the Ralph Nader voters in Florida have actually swung the vote to George W. Bush.
That's right.
Yes, they did.
Walt has the answer.
And in terms of another issue, in 2004, the folks waiting for hours upon hours in Ohio, and had some people believe that had that not happened, John Kerry might have won Ohio and then won the presidency. So there are a lot of factors involved in elections, and this is a great question. Because it's so important to think about when you think about that day in November, or in the case of New Mexico, thank goodness we have early voting, so you can vote early and not have to worry about lines at all. All right, another question.
My name is Cynthia, and I'm a journalism student here at NMSU. I was wondering how you guys think that social media has influenced this election, how it's different from previous election years.
Social media, very good question. You want to start with that one?
I had a chance to talk to a journalism class just earlier I guess it was last week. And what I told them is, I could tell you guys how we've done it for the last 30 years, and I can tell you how we're doing it now, but I'm not sure how we're going to be doing it 10 years from now or 15 years from now. But I am sure that it will be on social media. Everything is immediate. Everything. The idea of waiting to see what comes out in the next day's paper or on the next day's newscast, that they have people in the spin rooms now who are sending out tweets and sending out messages as soon as the words come out of the person's mouth. And I just think that's where people are going more and more for their information.
Overall, good or bad?
I'm a traditionalist. And so what you miss in that is you miss the filter. You miss having somebody there separating fact from fiction. And it requires people to take on that role for themselves. So for the people who have the ability to do that, I think it's good, but it gets back to what we were talking about before. It also gives you the opportunity to only find things that confirm what you already believe.
Lauren, your thoughts on social media?
Well, I agree with the things that Walt said. I would also say that, well, there's two perspectives. One, social media is just another tool for communicating. So from one perspective, I don't see that as much different than my posting a story online. And when I approach social media as a journalist, I approach it as a journalist and try to think about what I'm saying before I say it. I think social media, in terms of this election, it's the candidates, everyone who has an opinion has a direct audience, and in some cases those audiences are enormous, and a lot of the coverage has played out because of things happening on social media. So it's almost like just another town square. It's another venue where life is playing out, and something that has to be paid attention to. I do agree with Walt, especially as journalists, we have to be very careful. You don't want to be hearing something, it's going in one ear and it's going straight onto your Twitter feed. You want to think and process, and that is a challenge when we're all under pressure to report very quickly.
Yeah, I think the dialogue is great, but I fear, like you do, Walt, that people may not do further examination and get bad information. So that's the scary part. Another question.
My name is Filiberto. Do you think it's relevant to the election to show the emails that Hillary erased and the texts of Donald Trump?
To show the emails of Hillary Clinton and the texts, or the tweets of Donald Trump. Is that relevant?
Yes.
Is it relevant, Nick?
I think it is, because of what we were just talking about with social media. It is relevant because that's what people are reading all the time. We have to pay attention to it, whether it's superficial or whether it's not. It's there, and it has to be dealt with.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because I think probably more than any political candidate that I can think of, Donald Trump seems to use Twitter. I mean, that's his favorite communication tool. At
3 a.m.
to tweet.
Well, and if you saw that Secretary Clinton did something funny where she sent out some policy tweets at 3 a.m., I think, as a kind of a
It's
joke.
tough in 140 characters. That's the problem. So with that. Yes, another question.
How do you think social media or print or just TV in general has affected this political election and future political elections?
So this election, are you saying that you're asking if it will have a long-lasting effect no matter who wins? Okay.
Like if any political news or elections in the future, like how we view stuff through the news, or just be TV, print, or social media.
Okay. Nick, what are your
thoughts?
thoughts?
I think, like Walt said, everything is kind of gravitating towards social media. I think we'll always have broadcast and we'll always have newspapers and magazines, but everything is already gravitated towards social media because every reporter is on social media. I don't care what medium you are in. So I think it's going to be more and more driven by social media. That's just going to be a growing thing over time.
Fascinating analytics on this. Actually, I was at a conference recently, the Online News Association, and there was an expert, one of the foremost companies that studies how do people get to news websites. Facebook and Google are the top referrers. 70% of referrals come from Facebook and Google, and everything else is in single digits. Twitter was the only one, was the highest, and that was only 3%.
Yeah, and another thing that might help answer the question is that also, I think there was a study or some survey done that television commercials are less important now than they used to be. Even though they're spending more and more money on them, they're less important now because so much is done through social media.
Yeah, interesting.
If I could just speak to that really quick. I feel like there's, embedded in the question is this idea that what we do as journalists affects the way that people view the world or the way people view a candidate. And I'm afraid that that's not always true. Maybe I'm not afraid, maybe it's a good thing, but people come to the news with their own beliefs. So, for example, I write a story about border security, and it may include several sides of a story. and then you'll see it pop up in different social media circles on opposite sides of the political spectrum, in which one side has seized on one aspect of it, another side has seized on another. So you can have a single news story, it's not viewed the same way by all parties.
Yeah, very interesting. We have time for one more question.
Okay, do you think there's going to be an impact on Hispanics' votes according to what Trump has, his comments against them?
Lauren, you've already addressed this to some degree. This does appear to be a pivotal factor in this election, doesn't it?
Yeah, I can't speak to nationwide numbers, and I haven't looked at, yet at the voter registration in New Mexico, but just in speaking to people who are new U.S. citizens who are part of the Hispanic population, it's just incredible the energy that I spoke to one activist out of El Paso who has spent 20 years trying to get people to become U.S. citizens and register to vote. And he said it's been an uphill battle for decades. And then last year, at the start of the primaries, everything changed. People started coming to him. And it's been nonstop interest. So do people turn up on voting day? We don't know that yet, but there definitely is a whole new level of interest.
I have some friends who've been permanent residents in the U.S., and they're from Canada. They're not Hispanic. They're applying for citizenship. They felt no urgency to do that until this election. Walt, I want to ask you a question that kind of relates to the last audience question about the impact of the media. And I wonder if the impact can be greater if we get a surprise. We all remember 4 years ago in 2012 where, and this also plays into social media in a sense, someone had a cell phone in a private meeting with donors and potential donors for Mitt Romney and caught him speaking about the American public in a very different way than he did on the campaign stump.
That's right. The 40% are just takers. Thank you, 47%. But what you mentioned, that is the biggest fear for me, is the slam or the slander that comes in 1 day or 2 days right before the election. Candidate A had a drunk driving arrest that nobody knew of, had a domestic violence that nobody knew of. And it's real, it's proven, the documentation is right. It happened 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and you're bringing it to me the day before an election. What do I do with it?
The Albuquerque Journal has, I don't know if it's a policy, but it's something that gets talked about a lot. In the 2 days before an election, we are very, very careful about the information that gets published on a particular candidate, which is not to say that if there was actual news breaking that we would ignore it.
Right.
But there is an attention to that.
Well, because of the fact that there could be funny business going on.
We have that policy as well, but if it is a legitimate news story, I mean, it's a challenge. And there is no one right or wrong answer. It's a case by case.
We could have gone on for 3 hours, and this would have been interesting all the way through. Walt, Lauren, Christina, and Nick, thank you all for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you at home as well. I'm Fred Martino. Remember, in-depth broadcast journalism is only possible with your support. If you're not already a member, you can become a member at krwg.org, where you'll also find lots of news and viewpoints. Have a great week.